Nintendo has released a somewhat belated developer deep dive on perhaps the Switch 2 launch's most left field title, the wheelchair basketball eShop title Dragon Drive, presumably to tie into the game's first major uplift and to go alongside the new free demo, and perhaps to give the title a little bit more of a boost as it enters the holiday window. While I appreciate that this title wasn't everyone's tastes, and I haven't played it myself yet, any project from the heart of Nintendo's EPD team is so shrouded in mystery that I'm very happy to see more information on it. Huge thanks also to Nintos for the heads up on this. Firstly, and this might not sound like the most exciting part of an interview, but it often is, the list of the people involved. And here we have another reference to a group mentioned during the Game Chat and Tears of the Kingdom interviews, a programming management group within EPD, to whom one assumes the job of managing programming is assigned. We've seen itinerant programmers before, notably Takehiro Dota, who I believe serves as this department's head, who was a leading light on Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but also worked on Ring Fit and, of course, the Switch 2 system itself. Centralizing their programming team in this way is a pretty interesting strategy for Nintendo, as it theoretically would make it easier for programming advancements in one group to be of benefit to other teams at the same time. Then we also have Ekijiri and Yoshida, who hail from Production Group 5, better known as the Animal Crossing and Splatoon team. Let's go through this interview then. Now, as ever, I will read and commentate as we go. That said, while this is an interesting interview, I have less to commentate on in some parts, so there may be sections where it's mainly just looking at what they say. For this reason, I will endeavour to put this on the podcast as well, as I know some people enjoy listening in that format. Okay, we start with Yoshinori Konishi, referred to as Konishi from this point on, who introduced himself as Konishi, the director for Dragon Drive. Previously, I was involved, he says, in the Mario Kart series and Wii Fit, plus as a programmer and programming director. As both the director and programming director for Dragon Drive, he says I was involved in development from a feature and technical point of view. Hiroki Hamayu, referred to as Hamayu from this point, says, "Hello, I'm Hiroki Hamayu, one of the programmers who worked on Dragon Drive. I programmed the player character's movements, Joy-Con 2 controller mouse controls, and HD Rumble 2. I was a programmer on past titles such as Ring Fit Adventure and Nintendo Switch Sports. I love both developing and playing games that get your body moving." Takahisa Ikejiri, referred to as Ikejiri from this point on, says, "Hello, I am Takahisa Ikejiri, one of the designers who worked on the game. I was previously involved in the character design for the Splatoon series and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. For Dragon Drive, I was responsible for the art direction and character design." Then we have Isami Yoshida, referred to as Yoshida from this point on, who says, "Hello, I'm Isami Yoshida, the sound designer. I've previously worked on the sound effects for games such as the Splatoon 3 expansion pass, Wave 2 side order DLC, and The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. While working on the sound effects for Dragon Drive, I also discussed the background music direction with the composers and how each sound plays in the game world. The only thing that I'd add to this personally is that Ikijiri and particularly Yoshiba are relatively junior by Nintendo standards of incredibly long-standing team members, with Yoshida's first credit only being in 2017 with ARMS. Of course, that's probably to be expected with an innovative game like this, and the likelihood that newer voices will get their shot at coming forward. Okay, we start with the question, could you give us the brief introduction to the game? And Konishi explains it in his role as the director of the title. He says, "Yes, of course, Dragon Drive is a new style of sports game that you play intuitively by moving the two Joy-Con 2 controllers like mice. It's inspired by sports such as wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby, wheelchair motocross, BMX, and skateboarding. Players maneuver wheelchair-like vehicles as they compete in matches of up to 3-on-3. Of the mouse controls, he says, the game originated from a prototyping team formed to create something new. The purpose of this team was for members of diverse disciplines to come together and freely create new kinds of gameplay, not restricted to a particular genre, hardware, or feature. I had a manager-like role in that team. With the intent of gaining experience, we gathered up team members who were relatively new to the company and experimented every day. as we tested out lots of different ideas. One that particularly stood out was a gameplay mechanic created by Hamae-san, who involved using mouse controls to move the wheels of a wheelchair. Okay, let's pause and unpick this. First of all, note the manager-like role. I've talked before in a separate video, although thinking about it, it's possibly actually one that's still on Patreon, about how Nintendo frequently will assign leadership roles for short stints and in specific contexts, rather than necessarily have the same person lead each time. In this case, though, it's a pretty big deal to be tasked with creating a new type of gameplay, in effect for a Switch 2 launch window title to utilize the unique features of their system. However, it also appears that this group was not specifically and only working for Switch 2, as they note that this was not for any individual system, suggesting that they are continuing to experiment with other gameplay utilizations, which might be using new technology or perhaps using completely different contexts than video games. Having said all that, it's also an unenviable challenge for anyone to take on, having to try to figure out how to best utilize the Switch 2's specific unique mechanics of having dual mouse controls. Although dual mouse controls are incredibly interesting, it's not necessarily obvious how they could be integrated as a core mechanic, and I definitely didn't see anyone picking up on wheelchair basketball as a possible source of inspiration. Let's go then into programmer Hamayo's take. Hamayo-san was asked where you experimented with mouse controls from the beginning, and he replied, "It was about 2 years ago when I was prototyping. I'd heard that the controller for our next gaming console would have mouse functionality. Combine that with motion controls, I thought, and I could create a completely new control experience using mice. So I played around with various control schemes. But mouse controls are an established thing, so I kept replacing various inputs with mouse controls to try and inject some originality into the control scheme. A familiar comparison would be the flick gesture you make when scrolling on a smartphone. Flicking a smartphone's touchscreen is satisfying, and I was wondering if I could achieve the same with mouse controls. That's just one of the avenues I was exploring. During such experiments, I discovered that sliding the mouse had the potential to become a new control method requiring large body movements. Konishi adds, "We then tried using this sliding motion to create various gameplay mechanics, right? Like the chainsaw." Hamayo replies, "Right, the chainsaw gameplay where you start the motor by pulling the mouse towards you vigorously and use a swinging motion to cut through things was received very positively by the team. So we decided to experiment a bit further with this single-axis vertical sliding movement." Just to pause for a moment here, the Chainsaw game sounds absolutely awesome, and I'm slightly surprised they've talked it up, since it seems like such an obvious one to include in a future title as a delightful surprise. Having said that, it might be a difficult one to find a good location for. I'm not sure Mario Party is the best location for a virtual chainsaw when you're playing with the whole family, and it possibly doesn't have enough of an application as a game in its own right, but it is a cool idea. The questioner continues, asking, "So you thought it had potential after seeing the team's reaction. Could you elaborate a bit more on this single-axis movement?" Hamayo says, "To explore the possibilities of mouse controls, we played prototypes of various games that used, for example, one mouse in each hand, or combined mouse actions with control stick movements and button presses. During this process, we realized it was too demanding to move freely in any direction with both hands while simultaneously using the control stick and buttons. So, we pruned back the difficult actions, leaving only the satisfying ones, and we were left with the single-axis movement of sliding the mouse back and forth. Combining everything, including control stick and button controls, would have expanded the gameplay possibilities, but some team members remarked that humans aren't quite there yet as a species. We also experimented with combining mouse controls and HD Rumble too. We discovered that by adding a rattling vibration in sync with the mouse movements, it felt like you were actually turning a wheel. We tried pairing this with sliding the mice back and forth with both hands just to see what would happen. That's when we realized, hey, this feels a bit like maneuvering a wheelchair. I'd experienced riding a wheelchair for a research project back when I was a student, and it reminded me of that. So I created a gameplay mechanic where you control the wheels of the wheelchair like this. The full video is linked below, but it's a 20-second clip of the wheelchair moving around a grid and past some cone obstacles. Yet again, it becomes apparent that the design of the game is following the fun of the experience rather than a wish to service the aesthetics of having, as here, a wheelchair-using character. However, while the idea comes from that, there were clearly people who saw broader applications, as Konishi continues. He says, "This caught the attention of the producers, and I was asked to turn it into a sports game. We decided to prototype a little further to expand the possibilities of this gameplay mechanic. There were lots of ideas from various people, but I remember this being one in particular where lots of people said, 'I want to try it out.' At that point, the wheelchair was quite difficult to control as it didn't go in a straight line or moved about too quickly. However, from our experience implementing controls during the development of the Mario Kart series, I thought we could solve it on the system software side, and I wanted to expand on this idea with Hameo-san." Hameo-san continues, "The producers were saying it might be interesting to theme it around basketball. I was previously involved in the development of Nintendo Switch Sports, so I wondered if I could combine shaking the Joy-Con 2 controllers with mouse controls. The theme caught my imagination since wheelchair movement meant sliding the Joy-Con 2 controllers like mice, while the basketball element meant flicking the controller to throw the ball, both of which involve hand movements." Konishi added, "If we went with basketball, all you'd have to do is move under the basket and flick the Joy-Con 2 controller forward to shoot. I thought we could strike a good balance where moving requires a bit of practice, but shooting isn't all that difficult. However, given how the wheelchair was controlling at the time, I didn't think it was ready to be turned into a sports game just yet. So we iterated on it together for about 2 months. I'd write the specs, and Hameo-san would implement them. First, we had to get it moving in a straight line, so the prototype at the time reflected the mouse input directly in the movement of the wheels. You could feel like you're propelling yourself in a straight line, but in fact, you might be putting more force into one hand or sliding diagonally depending on your dominant hand. This would cause the mouse input to have slightly different values on each side, and you'd end up accidentally turning, making it tough to move in a straight line. So the first thing I did was to ask Hameo-san to implement a straightness correction so that players could move in their intended direction. This made it easier to move straight forward by aligning the rotation of both wheels when it detects that the left and right mice are inputting forward to a certain degree. Konishi added, "We took another 2 to 3 weeks to fine-tune the controls for moving in a straight line and turning. From there, we experimented to see what kind of rules would make the game more interesting. One idea that came out of this was tackling." Hameo says, "When we tested out racing with traffic cones placed around the game's course, we got more enjoyment and satisfaction out of crashing into the cones than avoiding them. So we tried creating a movement where the players head right for the opponent, like in a football tackle. Then the designers created a sumo wrestling ring for the action to take place in, and gameplay based on tackling the opponent and pushing them out of the ring was born." Konishi says, "Of course tackling isn't allowed in actual wheelchair basketball, but having the characters dribble while maneuvering the wheelchair would have made it too easy for the other players to steal the ball. So we decided to test and implement a wheelchair rugby-like mechanic where the player loses the ball when tackled. We kept the movement simple, no dribbling, tackle to steal the ball, and once you're under the basket, flick your wrist forward to shoot. This made it much easier to play as you can focus on the main action, which is maneuvering the vehicle with mouse controls." End quotes. Okay, all of this gives us the sense of the way the game was developed and iterated upon. It does make me wonder, though, how many other prototypes were being considered concurrently with this particular design. There is a strong indication that there were other ones, as it says that the wheelchair basketball design was particularly popular, so were there multiple possibilities with different teams of 2 paired up developing different kinds of projects? Now, it doesn't seem like the whole of the group were involved at this stage, and it also brings to mind the way that ARMS started out as a prototype internally. Still, I wonder, given that this is a much smaller game than Nintendo often puts out, whether we might see more smaller prototypes reach the eShop shelves. Another thing that Nintendo do a lot is give people tactile experiences to influence their work. This stemmed from when one of the hired guns that Shigeru Miyamoto brought in to help design Mario Art And a significant animation veteran as well, Yoichi Katabe, related to Miyamoto that at Toei Animation, their motto was, "Look at the real thing first." In this spirit, the first Mario Kart team drove go-karts to get a feel for them, and in this case, the developers got their heads around wheelchair basketball before they progressed too much further. Konishi relates, "No one on the team had used a wheelchair on a daily basis, so we began by gathering up reading materials so we could learn more about it. From an encyclopedia of wheelchairs to videos and essays by wheelchair athletes, and even manga about basketball or wheelchairs, we pulled together as much reference material as we could lay our hands on, and we studied it together. Also, in order to gain hands-on experience, we bought an everyday wheelchair and a sports wheelchair for the office so we could develop and drive at the same time. We compared the two wheelchairs and realized that the sports wheelchair has angled wheels, allowing for stable turning. However, since it was being developed for Nintendo Switch 2, which wasn't announced at the time, it was a highly confidential project, so we were restricted to the small space inside the office and we could only let loose down the hallway once everyone else had gone home for the day. Besides that, we also joined a wheelchair basketball experience as a team." Just cutting in again, I just find this anecdote completely hilarious. The idea that even within Nintendo's building, even within the heart of their development team, the fact that this was for Switch 2 was still top secret. It does make you wonder if eventually they will reach severance levels of secrecy in order to protect from even their core developers the secrets that they're working on. However, Konishi does say of trying wheelchair basketball for themselves, "We did indeed. A wheelchair basketball game was held in Osaka around the same time, and we had the opportunity to take part in a trial session after the match." Ikejiri says, "I wasn't prepared for how difficult it was to shoot the ball. In wheelchair basketball, the hoop is placed at the same height as in standard basketball, but since you take the shot sitting down, my shot didn't reach the basket at all." Hameo says, "Maneuvering a wheelchair is difficult unless you get the hang of when to apply and release force. You can't just propel yourself along smoothly in a single stroke. But it cemented for me how deep the controls are as you propel both wheels at full speed or put force into just one wheel to make a sharp turn. I thought that if we could authentically recreate the feeling of propelling a wheelchair and pursue a sense of realism, it would make for an interesting motion-based game." Ikejiri says, "We wanted players simply to enjoy the intuitive controls, so to make maneuvering the vehicle feel responsive, we emphasized the arms and wheels in the design. We kept everything else as simple as possible without cramming in too many elements." And the questioner says, "By the way, besides the development team getting to experience wheelchair basketball, I heard that real-life wheelchair basketball players also got the chance to try out the prototype." And Kanishi says, "That's right. We were partway through development when we received this golden opportunity. Because the players use wheelchairs in their daily lives, they were all really good at turning and moving backwards in the game. Of course, we learned a lot about the controls, but we gained even more insights watching them think about what to do on the court as they played. It differs from the wheelchair basketball in lots of respects. There's a half pipe below the goal, no dribbling, and players tackle their opponents to steal the ball. Nevertheless, they seem to accept these differences naturally and enjoy playing the game." Hameo says, "Seeing actual wheelchair basketball players get the hang of the game and its controls so quickly confirmed to us that it could work well as an intuitive control scheme. Above all, seeing everyone genuinely enjoying the game gave us confidence as developers that we were headed in the right direction." Konishi said, "We were also thankful for how delighted they all were that such a game was being developed, saying that it has the potential to shine a spotlight on wheelchair basketball. I was really happy to hear that." Then the questioner says, "So the core gameplay was starting to take shape. It had turned into a brand new sport with all sorts of elements mixed in, but what kind of trial and error led them there?" So Kanishi replies, "The controls for movement were starting to feel satisfying, and with tackles and quick turns, matches became more engaging. We then started thinking about how to give players more movement options, but that didn't mean any old moves would work. This game features unique analog controls where players spin the in-game wheels using mouse controls, linking their physical movements to their in-game actions. We saw this analog feel as a key element to enhance their sense of immersion in the gameplay. To give in-game movements that analog feel, we defined two conditions that needed to be met. First, movements had to be something that could be done in real life without feeling unnatural. Second, the player's mouse movements had to correspond clearly to their in-game actions. Hamayo explains, in wheelchair basketball, there's a technique called tilting, where one wheel is lifted off the ground. We realized that this would work well in the game and meet our conditions, since lifting one of the Joy-Con 2 controllers could correspond to that action. That's how we ended up implementing it into the game. That said, we also wanted to add something more dynamic. Konishi says, we looked into real-world movements and considered implementing techniques like a wheelie, where the front wheels stay lifted while moving, and a 180-degree turn. But those ended up conflicting with other controls and didn't quite deliver the analog feel we were aiming for. Then we came across a BMX technique called a bunny hop, where the rider first lifts the front wheel, then the rear to hop. We thought that maybe a wheelchair could hop too, if you tilted the left and then to the right in quick succession. So we tried drafting a spec for it, but, Hamayo says, we couldn't find any reference material showing someone actually performing a bunny hop-like movement in a wheelchair, so we had trouble picturing what kind of arm movements would make the controls feel convincing. We also wanted the movements to feel natural, so we were cautious about implementing actions that don't exist in real life. Konishi says, so I decided to give it a go myself. I got into a wheelchair and did my best attempt at a bunny hop. By quickly tilting left and right, I managed to lift off the ground by about 2 millimeters. I documented it on a video and showed it to Hamayo-san to convince him. Hamayo said, I wouldn't exactly call it a real-life movement, but the video helped me visualize it. Once we'd implemented the bunny hop, the addition of three-dimensional movement added new layers of strategy that didn't exist when the gameplay was restricted to two-dimensional movements. For example, being able to get rebounds more easily. The developers also discuss the innovation of the half-pipe under the goal, with Konishi saying, one of the challenges we faced for a long time during development was figuring out what to do with the edges of the court. We went through a lot of different ideas. Hamayo says, at first we placed walls around the edges of the court, but when we played proper matches with that setup, we noticed that the players tended to avoid the centre of the court and attack from the sides. That led to everyone crowding around the edges of the court, making it hard to move, and we realised it wasn't going to work. Konishi said, next we tried removing walls and added a rule where going out of bounds was penalised by losing possession of the ball. But that led to players focusing too much on pushing opponents out of the court. That shifted the core of the gameplay, which wasn't what we wanted, so we scrapped that idea too. End quotes. Now, incidentally, I'll just cut in here to say how interesting it is that their prototype stage is seemingly brighter and more open, suggesting that there were some graphical variants at play, and we get a fuller explanation for the reasons for how all this transformed later on. However, it seems like the decision to make the change was made relatively early in development, and the next version seems to have moved towards an indoor look, as seen in the next interview section, and later on we also see what appears to be a piece of concept art in which it seems like the silhouette of the character is as important as the design. Now, I do find it interesting as well the way that they have clearly consulted wheelchair basketball users throughout this, even though originally that wasn't the source of the design idea, and they've stuck with things which are fairly intuitive to actual players. I do wonder if this stopped them slightly from expanding the range of designs that they could have considered, with more fantastical options being ruled out, as they clearly viewed this as something of a sports game, and you could imagine in a different circumstance it fitting in well to a Nintendo Switch Sports style compilation. At any rate, the things that they discuss going forward are much more grounded in nature. So Hamayo continues, we tried adding gravel around the court. Konishi said, that's right, if a player left the court and entered the gravel area, they'd slow down but wouldn't drop the ball. That helped keep the significance of tackling to steal the ball. There are real-life street basketball courts with gravel around the edges, so we thought it wouldn't look out of place. But then it turned out to be unfriendly to beginners. Beginners would often head straight for the goal, fail to turn after shooting, and end up hurtling right out of the court. They'd shoot and then immediately plunge back into the gravel. Since they'd slowed down, they couldn't get out quickly even though the match was still going on. That frustrated players, so we ended up ditching the gravel idea as well. Konishi said, after anxiously deliberating our next steps, we resolved to place a half-pipe under the goal. Hamayo says, our team originally planned to split things up. Inside the court, the gameplay would focus on flat, two-dimensional movement. Outside the court, we wanted to create something with more three-dimensional movement, like wheelchair motocross. But then Konishi-san plonked a half-pipe right under the goal and said, here you go. Konishi said, I ended up defying the plan our team had agreed on, and I was the director too. Hamayo says that's when the going got really tough. Introducing the half-pipe meant players could now launch themselves high into the air, adding airborne action to matches. We had to design and implement the physics for aerial tricks, like catching the ball mid-air or performing a backflip shot. But once we built it, the extra three-dimensional movement made the game even more fun. So ultimately, I think it was a brilliant idea. Konishi admits it was tough though, but there was a deep reason behind it. Placing the half-pipe actually solved three major challenges we were facing at the time all at once. Our biggest struggle was that the slam dunk action lacked analog feel at the time. The way it worked was if you moved under the goal and swung the Joy-Con 2 controller upwards, your character would automatically jump and perform a dunk. We'd put so much effort into making the two-dimensional movement feel analog, but when it came time to dunk, the whole vehicle just suddenly launched into the air, which felt abrupt. Ikejiri explains, we spent a lot of time deliberating how to design it so it didn't feel out of place. At one point we even considered attaching a giant spring to the wheels so the whole thing could bounce up into the air. Konishi says, once we placed a half-pipe under the goal, players could jump and carry the ball to the hoop much more naturally. In the end, we designed it so that you can pull off a dunk shot by swinging the Joy-Con 2 controller just as you reach the basket. Hamayu says, you need to enter the half-pipe with enough speed to lift off the ground and at just the right angle to reach the hoop. Just jumping anywhere while swinging the Joy-Con 2 controller doesn't trigger a dunk. It only activates when you swing it near the hoop, which helped us achieve a satisfying analog feel. Konishi adds, the second challenge, which I briefly mentioned earlier when talking about the gravel outside the court, was that players couldn't immediately return to the centre of the court after taking a shot. But once we'd added the half-pipe under the basket, even if a player kept moving straight after taking a shot, they could ride up the slope and come back down, making it much easier to return to the centre of the court. Ikejiri said, in this game, the match doesn't stop when points are scored. In most sports, the match halts and resets after one side scores, but in this title, the game carries on without interruption. That means even if the other team scores, you can grab the ball right away and launch a fast break towards their basket. Because the action keeps going, players feel a sense of urgency that makes them want to shout, get back on defense. Konishi says, the third challenge we faced was figuring out how to approach character design. We were still exploring what the playable characters would look like and hadn't settled on a clear direction. Ikejiri confirms, but once we'd introduced the half-pipe, the game turned into a more acrobatic sport where players could jump high and even tip over if they missed a move. We figured that with gameplay like this, the characters would need helmets and armor. That led us to the current character designs. And I'm just going to chip in here as well, because it seems that although the character designs were a large part of what appeared to put people off this game, it is curious that this was built out of respecting the internal logic of the game title. And the odd thing is that often elsewhere, Nintendo abandoned or created their own logic, and there's references to maybe doing that here as well, with the springs being put into the wheelchairs. We also saw with Mario Kart World that the idea of eating food to change costume could become intuitive in-game without it being anyway related to the real world. However, in the next section there's a clear reference to ice hockey in terms of their influences, this being the NES game. Again though, these three ice hockey players are clearly distinctive beyond superficial features like the colour of their helmets and equipment. It also feels odd considering what we've discussed recently in relation to Metroid and the love of Japan of having characters with faces. The Dragon Drive players could as well be robots for all we can make out what they're like. This is explained during the next section as a way to allow the audience to imbue the characters with their own personality, which is kind of interesting and follows the same kind of principles as characters like Link. Literally, the player's linked to the game, but it feels odd in 2025 in an IPH. I guess for a small demo, it really wasn't necessary for Nintendo to create some massive, great new range of different characters. They wanted to keep it simple, and they wanted to keep it linked to the sports mechanic. At any rate, in the next section, they discuss how the different player types were balanced. Ikejiri says, if there were only one type of character, player skill would more directly determine the outcome of a game. But having characters with different abilities creates opportunities for trial and error and strategic thinking, such as this team had several centres, but that team had more forwards, or maybe next time we should try a different combination. We thought it would allow matches to unfold in a variety of different ways, depending on the player's ideas. Hamayu said, when the team was playing the game during development, there was a time when many of us preferred using the guard character, who has a smaller physique and can turn quickly. But when we had one large-bodied centre among many guards, that player could really shine using their extra weight and height to grab the ball more easily. The well-balanced forward type could also adapt to the opposition's mix of characters to help steer the game according to the situation. Konishi said, team composition and strategy can dramatically change how a game unfolds, so I encourage players to experiment and to find a playstyle that suits them best. Ikejiri confirms about the designs of the characters. We wanted to make sure players could easily tell which character types were on the court during a match, even from a distance. Since players make vigorous upper body movements to control their wheels during matches, it was difficult to distinguish between character types from afar. Plus, while the three character types have different acceleration and turning abilities, they all share the same top speed. That's why we didn't want to oversimplify them as light and fast or heavy and slow. For example, the large and heavy centre can reach the same top speed as the small and light guard by propelling the wheels with strong burly arms. We carefully considered how each character should move and look on the court to make them visually convincing. In the end, we incorporated design elements from real-life sport wheelchairs to help express those differences in ability. Each type of sport wheelchair is tailored to the specific needs of its sport. For the physically strong centre, we added features inspired by wheelchair rugby, such as a metal bumper on the front. The well-balanced forward draws from wheelchair basketball, while the agile guard uses design elements from wheelchair motocross. By incorporating features from various sports, we were able to distinguish the characters clearly and make their roles easy to recognize. Ikejiri says, in fact, we deliberately held back on giving the characters in this game individual personalities. Instead, we aimed for a design in which the player's own gestures, playstyle, and techniques became the character's personality, and that uniqueness is directly conveyed to other players around the world. Konishi said, maybe you'll pull off a slick shot by dodging your opponent with a quick turn, or set yourself up the three-point line, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to take your shot. However you play, we hope you'll keep honing your skills and let your personality shine through. Konishi also says, before we'd added the bonus, which is the landing a trick shot gives you a small bonus compared to a regular shot, we were testing the game and noticed a difference in mindset between players who focused on winning and those who prioritized tricks. Those focused on winning wanted their teammates to go for a solid 2-point shot rather than to risk botching a more difficult trick shot. So we decided to add a bonus based on the trick's difficulty, so even players focused on winning could see the value of going for a trick shot. Winning is important, of course, but we also wanted players to enjoy the thrill of landing cool shots and bringing heat to the court, just like in street basketball. Since trick shots with bonus points can affect the outcome of a game, I think the difference in mindset between those two types of players has diminished. Of the term bringing heat to the court, Konishi confirms that they are trying to capture a street basketball vibe. The park, he says, which served as the entry point for online play, was also inspired by street basketball. It consists of a court where the matches are played and its surrounding environment and players. He goes on, in street basketball it's common for players who happen to be there that day to form teams on the spot and take turns playing. That kind of setup is known as a pickup game. When I learned about that, I thought it could work well with the matchmaking system we had in mind. In typical online play, matchmaking is based on players selecting the same mode or wanting to play the same match type. In this game, though, players first gather casually in the park, where they can play games, watch others, or practice on an open court. I think it has a lot in common with how street basketball works. And the questioner then also discusses the reason that they moved away from an open air setting for more of an underground feel. Konishi explains, in the early stages of development, the backdrop was more on the bright side, but during internal test play sessions where we invited employees to try the game, we received quite a bit of feedback along the lines of, the ball's hard to see, or I can't tell where it is. Many sports games use a top-down camera that shows the entire playing area, allowing players to see where the ball is and plan their actions accordingly. This means that they rarely lose track of the ball. In this game, though, the ball often ends up outside the player's screen. The interviewer says, since the camera is generally positioned behind the player, it's easy to lose sight of the ball when it goes to the side or behind them. And Konishi says, precisely. We did try using a top-down camera at one point, but it just didn't feel right. The sense of immersion was lost, and it made the gameplay feel less engaging. We thought to ourselves, this isn't the dynamic hands-on control we were going for. If we wanted players to feel as if they were controlling a wheelchair, we felt we had to go with a third-person view. However, the downside is that your field of vision becomes limited, which makes it easier to lose sight of the ball. To address this, we made the terrain dark and the ball yellow to create a strong visual contrast. Yoshida says even so, with a third-person view you still can't see the ball once it's gone behind you, so we filled in the gaps with sound effects and music. For example, you might hear the ball hit the ground and think, it landed behind me. Speaking of sound, the questioner says, once the background colour and the overall vibe of the park were set, you started designing sound effects and music to match them, right? And Yoshida says, yes. When we heard the term street basketball, we began by exploring what kind of music and sounds would feel right for that setting. We did a lot of research, which included watching matches of street basketball teams in Japan. In one professional match, we noticed the background music shifting dramatically whenever there was a change of possession. We thought it might be interesting to incorporate that into our game, and it worked really well. The sudden change in music made it clear immediately that the ball had changed hands, even if it happened off screen. It was a moment where a street basketball element fit perfectly into our game's design. Yoshida said, we placed a lot of importance on the ball's sound effects. We made particular sound effects stand out, like the ball being stolen behind you or a pass being received, so players could easily follow the flow of the game. This title supports surround sound, so if you're playing with a compatible setup, it can also sound as if the ball is really being stolen behind you. Also, when you're going for one of those dunk shots mentioned earlier, the background music and ambient sound intentionally gets quieter. From the moment you launch yourself from the half-pipe, the surrounding noise fades, and your focus narrows to the ball and the basket in front of you. We wanted to create a tense, breathless moment. Then, once you've made the dunk and the sound returns, you hear your teammates clapping. By using that kind of contrast, we were aiming to tie everything together into a more dramatic, unified production. Yoshida also says that was something we really paid attention to, the sound effects from far away. Having park vibes in mind, we wanted the players to get the sense of what others in the park were doing through sound alone. Even if you can't tell exactly what's happening, you can still get a sense that someone's practicing shots or dashing across the court. We designed the sound so you can hear what's happening even from pretty far away. Konishi also says of the park vibes that, yes, I think the idea was put out there quite early. I loved going to parks as a child and often played there with classmates. Depending on the day, there might be older or younger kids around, and what we played would change based on who happened to be there and how many of us there were. We might start out with just a few friends playing catch, but as more people showed up, we'd switch to dodgeball or tag. That kind of atmosphere was something the whole team could relate to, and it tied in nicely with the pickup game concept, so park vibes became something we all valued. They also talk about verbal communication being replaced by waving or clapping, and Ikejiri says, yes, this was a conscious decision. We implemented what we call a motion sync system, which maps gestures made with the Joy-Con 2 controllers, such as waving, to in-game actions. This enables simple forms of communication like high fives and clapping. We deliberately left out verbal communication because we wanted players to be able to experience the unique kind of interaction made possible by analog motion controls. We believe that gestures alone can often convey emotions more clearly and instinctively than words. And of game chat, Ikejiri says, players move lots about the screen during gameplay, so it's fun to see their movements appear on screen via the camera in game chat. Earlier, I mentioned that we left out verbal communication, but I think using game chat for advanced coordination is another way to enjoy it. Kanishi says, you can have strategic conversations during a game, like I'm going for a three-pointer or mark that player. Ikejiri adds, there are also little diversions like jump rope and sumo, so if you need a break from matches, you can hang out with friends and play something else. Yoshida confirms as a closing message, I'm atrocious at sports, especially ball games, and I don't fare much better in video games. Even so, the more I played this game, the more I felt that even someone like me can find a role that fits them. For example, if the other team scores, I grab the ball and pass it to a teammate further down the court. Pulling off precise moves in offense is definitely satisfying, but this game offers lots of alternative ways to play. I hope people who don't think of themselves as sporty will give it a try. The sound team work hard to ensure that the sound effects convey the thrill of successfully landing trick shots and the techniques, and we hope players will enjoy this game through the sound. Ikejiri says, as designers, we focused on making sure the controls felt intuitive and responsive. Something I personally want to call out is the motion sync system that lets players raise their arms to clap and praise others or exchange high fives. I feel like we've created a form of interaction that's unique to this game. I'm sure you'll make all sorts of discoveries once you get your hands on it, so please give it a try. Hamayu says, my focus, which ties into what Ikejiri-san said, was making sure the game responds closely to how players move from a programming perspective. For instance, even if a player's name isn't displayed and you can't tell who's controlling a character, their movements are reflected so clearly that you might think to yourself, is that so-and-so, just from a quick glance. This game offers a fresh experience made possible by the Joy-Con 2 controllers, so if you're into trying out new things or gadgets, I'd love for you to check it out. Konishi says, back in April 2025, there was a hands-on event for Switch 2, and I had the chance to watch people playing Dragon Drive at our booths. There was a pair of visitors who played exceptionally well, so I spoke with them afterwards. One of them was reportedly good at action games, while the other claimed to be bad at them. So I asked the second person, how are you doing so well even though you're supposedly bad at action games? And they replied, maybe because I use a mouse every day at work. Hearing that made me realize just how much potential this game has. Of course, it's great for people who enjoy action games or being physically active, but we especially want those who aren't as confident in video games or sports to join in and have fun. In fact, you might discover a hidden talent and surprise yourself with how well he takes the controls. We recently released a free demo of this game where you can play offline matches against bots, so I hope you'll download it and check it out. End quotes. Okay, so where does this leave things? For me personally, I'm intrigued to check out the demo, but with Metroid Prime 4 coming up, that will be a while yet. I do wonder who they're timing this drop for. My guess is that they didn't want people to pick up the game with Switch 2 around the holiday season and not be able to find matches because it might not be the most popular of titles, but it also fits a timing where the only title that Nintendo has left for this year is Metroid Prime 4, which potentially in Japan is going to be a smaller deal. Does this mean that this title, despite its aesthetic choices in having rather depersonalized people, is targeting Japan a little bit more? Or perhaps they just think the two markets are so distinct that there's no risk of an overlap by promoting Dragon Drive during Metroid Prime 4's final hype cycle approach. Or even perhaps they think that while people are waiting to download Metroid Prime 4, they might mess around with Dragon Drive and discover a new love for it. At any rate, I'll have more Metroid Prime 4 stuff to talk about tomorrow, or hop to Patreon to get that early. Check out the videos on screen for other developer interviews. Thanks as ever for watching, and thanks to the channel's Patreon members, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.